Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric. Today I have a couple projects to share with you. As you might have noticed from the title, which I believe is going to be something about possibly success, I am in doubt as to whether or not the project that I have to share with you that I finished is a complete success. But I'm going to save that until the end of this video. And first I'm going to start off with, well, let's update. I have some English paper piecing that I'm excited to share. And I have some updates as to how I'm doing with this crazy transitional time in my life. So it's not the first time one of my children have flown the coop, but this time it feels much more permanent because most of the child's stuff has migrated with her as she has gone north. And with the emptying of a lot of space, it means I can finally organize and set up my house, my sewing room, in the way that I had envisioned when I moved here. And that means my husband is building me a custom cutting table. And instead, I mean, if you follow any of the sewing room vlogs and social media posts that are out there, there's so many different ways people put together cutting tables. But for me, what I want, I need something that isn't just for fabric. I need a space that transitions from my fabric to my my spinning, my fiber crafts. And so, although I'll probably continue to do most of my spinning in front of the TV while I am spending the evenings with my husband watching TV in we have a little snug of a room that we watch TV in. And while that will be where I do most of my spinning, I do want to have the ability to set up my sewing room, to spin and to work on maybe the finishing of some of my projects. I know that when I have woven, yes, I have actually done a few weaving pieces, although I will, for those of you that have followed me know, I will readily admit I am not a weaver. My daughter is the weaver. I am not. But when I have done a few woven scarves and such with the fringe, I love going into my sewing room and using my quilting tools, my rotary cutter, my quilting rulers to even up the fringe on the scarves that I make. And so there's a number of times in which my various different crafts overlap. And I want a sewing room that facilitates that overlap. Now, when I moved here, the room that is now my office, I had no intention for that to be filled with anything dealing with my sewing. But because of the situations that evolved at that time, it was necessary for my first sewing room to actually be in the space that is my office. And the truth is, I'm not sure I'll be able to ever get some of my sewing supplies out of that room. In fact, it's just recently ended up getting more of my sewing supplies added to it. So as I was saying, I'm trying to get things organized a little better, trying to understand my space. And one of the I guess positives of having a need for multiple spaces to store your stuff is that you do have to walk from room to room. You have to move around a little bit, and getting up and moving is always a good thing, even if it's not my preferred thing. And so we're trying to get my sewing room put together. My husband and I sat down and we talked about what I would like in a cutting table. And there's just, as I said, there's so many different ways people put these things together, so many little construction hacks using things, flat pack furniture, especially from IKEA, and making cutting tables out of that. But I really like the heavy duty sturdy table that my husband has in his one of the tables he has in his wood shop. And so when we were sitting and talking, I told him, I said, I don't need anything fancy. I need something that, what I'd like to have is something that is in 2 pieces, so that when I push them both together, I have a really large cutting surface for very large projects, or when I'm making, you know, clothing for myself. It's nice to have a large surface. But for most of my needs, I'd like to have it so I can have it able to be separated into 2 pieces, so that if I need more space, I can take my cutting table and shove it to the outside of the room. There are times when it's nice to have a large floor space to work on. So he and I sat down and we talked through the project. We talked through what I needed. We decided I would like to have on one of the pieces of the rolling table, one of the sides, I'd like to have some drawers. I would like some place to store my extra cutting mats, my larger rulers. So we went through all of that. And I wish I had a picture to share with you this week of the finished project. But while one of the tables is ready to paint, the other table is still ready, waiting for the drawers to be put in and the paint to be applied and the tabletop. So crossing my fingers, by the time I make my next video, I will have some photos of my new sewing table to share with you. But I wanted to share all this because I wanted to help you know that we've gone from moving my daughter out to construction and rearranging my sewing room. And so the fact that I have any finished projects, any finished English paper piecing today to share, it is really quite a statement of my determination to have something to share with you, because it is chaos. And you might notice behind me, there is a new, and I'll put a picture here, there is a new little mini quilt behind me. I did go into my sewing room and using my smaller mats and using little balancing things in odd angles, I did manage to get that stitched out this week. And yay me! I have made huge progress in going through and organizing things ahead of the final staging. But you kind of get spoiled. And you get spoiled with having the extra tools and the bigger mats and the convenience. And when all of it goes away, it's not that you can't go back to the old methods, the old way you did it. You just don't want to. and you know, maybe it's a sign of being exhausted, or maybe it's a sign of just being lazy. But I really didn't want to go in my sewing room when it isn't in nice, neat fashion. But I did, and I was really glad that I did. It is a change of the seasons. It is time for me to change the decor around my house, and I did do that. And one of the things that I managed to do was I finally, with the help of my husband, finally found a place to hang up a quilt that I made now many years ago. Probably 14 years ago? Well, let me rephrase that. So I designed a set of quilt patterns that I could use to help others learn how to quilt, or to inspire other people to learn how to quilt. So I designed a set of 12, and then I modified them to make another set of 12 that could be done, much like with English paper piecing, the notion of working on quilt blocks without having the convenience of a gigantic rotary cutter mat and rotary cutters. I wanted to have quilt blocks that could be done in more traditional style with templates, but that were really friendly to beginners, really friendly, especially to younger, younger quilters, and maybe quilters who had some physical deterrents that made it so they just did not want to use a rotary cutter. Because as much as I love my rotary cutter, I will acknowledge that it is a sharp blade. It requires oftentimes more expensive tools. And while it can speed things up, it can also be intimidating if you have motor control issues that, while you can, say, knit or English paper piece or do much of the handwork, the slicing through a layer of fabric accurately is not something you're going to be comfortable with. So I designed these patterns now, as I said, probably about 14 years ago. And when I was designing them, I never intended them to be a sampler. The initial, when I was first coming up with them, was just to show different types of blocks and different types of techniques that could be done relatively easily for a new quilter. Then I thought, okay, let's make it into a sampler. Well, I have software. So when I'm putting it together as a sampler, I can do it all in the software, and I don't actually have to make each of the 12 blocks. Again, when I made them the first time, I was using the ugliest fabric I had in my stash that I just wanted to get rid of. And while I did eventually make it into a quilt top, I have not yet finished quilting it. It doesn't look too offensive to me. But it's not exactly, ooh, run out and get that one done first. But I had used the software to create the layout and the color of this sampler quilt. And then I realized I really should actually have that specific quilt made to show that, yes, I can actually do that specific quilt and it can look good as a sampler. So without further ado, here is that sampler pack sampler. And now, even though I had found another place I could hang it up, I love it in my sewing room against the brick wall right above my daybed that I have in that room. I want to still have it in my sewing room because I have found that it is nice to have somewhere I can take a nap. And due to many other things that have happened in the last couple of years, the daybed, which used to be in my tiny little room that I had as my initial fiber studio when I was doing these vlogs about 2 years ago, that room has had to be turned into something else for my husband. and so everything got rearranged, and now I have my daybed in the sewing room, which was always my original intent. And even this week, it was so wonderful because I have my daybed in there. I have my old recliner. I used to watch TV in my recliner, but then I found that when I did my crafting, the recliner is not, for me, the most ergonomic body position. And I was getting problem with my shoulders for the way that the recliner pushed me. So the recliner has now been in my sewing room, which is wonderful when my husband comes in and visits with me, keeps me company while I'm sewing. He sits in the recliner. The cats love it. And so I have a daybed and I have a recliner. And just this week, with the wind having decided to descend in great force and for the wintry chill to return, I sat down in my recliner right in front of my little, I have a pellet stove in that room, right in front of my little fire, and I read a book. Can't sew in my sewing room much, but I read a book. And I love having this quilt sitting there, hanging there above the area that is kind of a little sitting area for me. And I think that while it wasn't in my initial plan to have this configuration, I even now have, I'm storing some of my son's stuff, and I have his TV for the moment. And so I even have a TV in there. I had my daughter's TV in the sewing room until she moved. And now I have my son's TV, at least for the interim, while I store his stuff. And so, well, it was never my intent to have this space have this much comfortable seating. It is quite nice to have it. And because we're making the modular cutting table surfaces, I will be able to move things around. I'll have plenty of storage. And I look forward to being able to share that with you in the next video. But despite the chaos, despite the weather, despite the fatigue that I have had, now that I have allowed myself to rest, I have managed to get my spring quilts up. I have this one that I made a year or two ago up in my entryway. And I've done a little bit of getting ready for spring and embracing this changing season. I have also managed to overcome my worries and finish 3 English paper piecing blocks for you, because I knew that this video was going to be out at the beginning of spring, and I wanted to be able to share with you a very spring-inspired English paper piecing. But I had 2 other blocks in my queue in front of that spring one that I wanted to share. And I was a little nervous that it was going to be another case of blocks that didn't want to, little pieces that wanted to be finicky, but they weren't. These came together so sweetly. And I could have, if I would have wanted to throw off my count and dig through my box a little more, I could have made a 3rd one of the same type by having a solid, because this is actually, bring in close, you can see it's actually pieced. I could have had a solid center in either one of these. You will notice they are the same block, sort of. This one, this one is the next in my queue, and it is called the Grandma's Brooch, meaning it resembles the really fancy jeweled brooches, especially of the 1930s, in all of its little segments. If you did this up in different fabrics, you'd probably get, instead of seeing a star so much, you could see the facets of a jeweled brooch. Well, this one is Grandma's Spring Brooch. And the difference between the 2 of these is these squares have been split. This is a solid square, and this one has been split. Both of them were a breeze. I didn't have any issue with needing to fudge anything. They just came together. I'm going to try to include a solid octagon in the center. For the center, if you want to do that variation, I'll try to include a template for that. My first attempt of printing one out, I don't think my printer liked it. It's kind of wonky. This is an octagon, and it is an octagon that is very much symmetrical. All the pieces worked well. But another thing is, if, like me, you go and print it out and it doesn't look quite right, you can print out these pieces, lay them out, and trace around to create, like a puzzle piece, trace out your own octagon. I have to admit, while hexagons are really the fun thing to do, octagons are mathematically easier to create. So I have those 2 for you. But the block that I wanted to make sure that I had out for the beginning of spring is this one. And it's just a simple flower basket. This down here is actually 2 pieces. I chose a fabric that had blocks of color to mimic a woven basket kind of motif. I decided to go ahead and have bold colors in the big corners rather than just going with the solid muslin. And of course, I had to do it in my purples because I do love, as you can see, I do love my purples. And so for me, this was such a fun block to make. I was able to use a couple of my hand-dyed fabrics from years ago. In fact, I used them in each of the blocks, and I have to admit, this one, the use of my hand-dyed in both of these, let's get that there, both of these really made me happy. I just love how those wonderful hand-dyed fabrics ended up looking with these more vintage. In fact, in most of the cases, these vintage are actually, oh my goodness. Wow, I think they actually are now antique fabrics. Ah, okay. We're not quite to the 30s yet, so we're not quite to technically antique fabric, but wow, time does seem to be flying by, because these are fabrics that are definitely go back to the 30s, and the feed sacks, the flour sacks of the 1930s fabrics in the United States. So those are my EPP blocks for this week. Please make sure, if you want them patterns, go to my blog and download the pattern. And let me know if you decide to make them. I really enjoyed doing these. They worked, well, this one just has so few pieces. They worked up so easily. And you know, it was just a joy. So I'm glad I was able to share those with you. Now, let's move on to the final reveal. Those of you that have been following, you know that I made my, inspired by the Musselbugh hat, after many tearing it apart and trying again because I didn't have the pattern. And then someone was really nice enough to buy me the pattern, so I had to make my own Musselbugh hat. And I have said many times, I have really, really bad tension in my knitting. And it's one of the reasons I don't use patterns. But I decided I was going to follow the pattern to the letter. I was going to do all the correct increases. I was going to use the chart. I measured my head. I followed the instructions to a T. And I was really pleased, really quite pleased with the way the increases looked, the decreases looked. I mean, just was loving it. I tested my gauge when I was at the crown of the hat where I was supposed to. I tested my gauge. I followed the charts. Now, let me show you how this one fits me, okay? The one I made by trial and error. I would say it's a tiny bit small for my head. I think it's perfect for my husband's head. But he doesn't have all the hair I have. So, there's the one I made for my husband. Yes, I've been laughing since I finished this. And here's mine. I think it's big enough. I took this off the needles and I just started laughing. I hadn't even finished weaving in the end. And I knew we had an issue. My husband was just sitting there watching me, wondering why I was laughing. So yeah, it fits. It fits wonderfully well. It is so loose. A strong wind would blow this away. Now, I should say, I made this for my daughter, and my daughter and I both actually do like loose fitting hats rather than tight fitting hats. And my daughter has much more hair than I have. So this might still work for her. But my tension is so loose. I even purchased some of those tension rings that you can now get. And I put 2 of them on my fingers to try to adjust the tension of the yarn so that it would not get so loose. But for me, the minute I get into knitting in the round, it just, and it doesn't matter how small the needles are, it doesn't matter what the gauge is, it just relaxes. And when this hat got done, it was much larger than I expected it to be. So if I wanted to make this again, I would definitely go down a size in the circumference. But I did do all the decreases the way that the pattern had suggested. I did the increases the way the pattern had suggested. So here is mine. Here is the patterns. I'll show you the inside. Oh dear, I may have just figured, oh, I think that's the inside. There's the inside and the inside. The opened up hat. And I can't open this one because I actually, to make it easier for my husband, I've actually stitched the crown to the crown. So, mine, based on me just being inspired by, let's see, yes, based on me being inspired by this wonderful Musselbugh hat that I kept seeing show up on YouTube. So it was really interesting too, because as I was getting ready to finish this, the designer, I think it's, oh, I'm not going to pronounce her name right, so I'll just put it here. The designer of this hat, she actually released another update on the hat and another video to help others when they want to make it. So again, it is a success. It fits. It looks lovely. It is so soft. It used up the majority of 2 skeins because I held 2 skeins together to get a thicker gauge fiber so I could use bigger needles. It is lovely. I would definitely wear it. And I might actually make it again if I have a need for a nice, thick, warm, cover my ears well hat. And here's the thing that so I'm not a big knit hat wearer because I don't like how it feels on my forehead. I don't like if it causes static. This is superwash, so it can't be shrunk down at all. But it's really soft. It's really lovely. It's not causing a lot of static. It's not messing up my hair too much. So as much as it is much larger than I was expecting, it actually would be a hat I could wear easily because it does cover my ears without causing any itching on my forehead, without being too tight. So here, turn and show the sides. So I think it's a success. There's always that little question mark. And so it is still, I would still highly recommend this pattern for people who are trying to figure out how to use some of their hand spun. Because if you don't have the gauge issue I have, where it doesn't matter if it was that I did the correct gauge on the top, the minute I was just going around in a circle. So as we were doing the increases, there was more tension just the way that the needles were on my, I should say the project was on my needles. And I went with the magic loop as opposed to double pointed needles to start it off. And I do know that when people transition from double points to circular needles and vice versa, there can be a gauge difference in their own knitting. I understand that. For me, that gauge difference is obviously extremely noticeable because the gauge that I had on the top matched the charts well. But I'm sure that if I took the gauge anywhere down below, it would be skewed. So if you don't have the extreme tension issues that I have, I think you would have much greater initial success with this, getting it more of the size you'd want. But for your hand spun, it is, I think, a really good pattern because it is going to, it is going to knit up following a gauge chart rather than specific amount of stitches, specific type of yarn. And that's one of the things, I mean, it really is for me, one of the things that I like to see in a pattern that I am interested in making is, can it easily translate to my hand spun? Because while commercial yarn, indie dyer yarn is something that I have a feeling that we all tend to collect, I'm a hand spinner and I prefer to work with my hand spun. I prefer start to finish it to be my efforts. Not because I have any problem with the commercial, it's just what feels good to me. It's what I enjoy. And so I do recommend, if you haven't taken a look at this pattern and you are a hand spinner, certainly consider it. And let me know in the comments or send me a message if you have other patterns that you have found work really well for hand spun yarn. I know that most things that are called vanilla have a tendency to work well because you can really play with the gauge. But hand spun can be used with cables and can have color work and all of those things. And having a basic knit that allows you to use any gauge of yarn opens you up to being able to do patterning on said product. And that is the thing. I could see how, if you know how to do the math, this hat would be fabulous to do some color work in this section. It would be a fabulous base to maybe try to throw a cable in, because it is a blank slate for creativity. And it's a blank slate for creativity that is hand spun yarn friendly. So, and single skein, orphan skein friendly too, as you can see here. So, and I again, just remind, I am not promoted at all by this designer. I'm not getting any kickback from this. No, I just know that it's kind of like going back to my quilting. With whether it's the quilting or whether it's the spinning, I know that it's so much friendlier when the patterns, when the recipes allow us to have success in the materials and abilities we have. I'm all for the people who are doing all the math and doing all the calculations and creating beautiful patterns. But we do have a need for patterns and recipes that allow for us to have success when the materials we're using don't conform to a commercial standard. When we don't conform to a commercial norm. Patterns that take that into consideration appeal to me because they are a great place to either start your journey or to take a break if your journey has gotten a little exhausting or complicated. And I think we all have those times in our lives that we all reach that point. And we can tend to lose our mojo. We can tend to lose our knitting mojo, our spinning mojo, our quilting mojo, because we just get overwhelmed. And whether that being overwhelmed originated with the project we're working on or originated with what our family members are doing, or our workplace are doing, or what the world is doing. When we become overwhelmed, we lose our mojo, and we can lose our creative mojo, which for a lot of us, we do our creating in order to offset the stressors from everywhere else that we can't control. And so it's nice to have projects that really are developed in a way to meet our comfort need, to meet our atypical need, our non-conforming to the world need. Whatever our reason to non-conform is, or I should say, whatever the reason we are non-conformists might be, we need it's good to have designs, patterns, recipes that take that into consideration. We have a lot of designers out there who are doing a lot of the math and the calculations to help us be able to make sweaters and articles of clothing regardless of our bodies that we have and the uniqueness of our bodies. They are to be commended because they are doing the calculations, they are doing the math. Pattern companies, whether it's knits or sewing, it is wonderful that they are becoming more inclusive as opposed to excluding or making it very difficult for us if we don't fit a certain norm. And I think we need to celebrate that. But we also need to remember that while it is wonderful to have somebody else do all the math for us, while it's wonderful for somebody to inspire us, sometimes it really does come down to the work that we do, the effort we put into it, the thing we learn. And we learn better when we are not restricted, when we have tools that help us learn, when we have tools that help us do the math, when we have tools that help inspire us to learn a new technique. So, kudos to the designers out there who are taking that into consideration, who are providing us with those patterns. Because one of the things, whether it was 14 years ago or a couple years ago when I started these vlogs, one of the things that I have found is that there are so many wonderful, complicated, beautiful, exquisite patterns out there. But sometimes it's really hard to find the basic. It's really hard to find something to start somebody off with or restart ourselves with. For those of you that have followed my channel, you know that I've had some physical impairments over the last decades now. And I had to reteach myself how to knit and how to crochet because I had so much struggle holding a crochet hook, holding a knitting needle. And I have just been so grateful and so amazed with how I've been able to regain the dexterity that I had almost entirely lost. Not to even mention holding a quilting needle so that I could actually do the hand quilting on my quilts, or the hand sewing to put together these guys. I had to work really hard to get back that dexterity. And the only reason that I managed is that I already had a huge volume of knowledge in the crafting world. I already knew how to knit. I already knew how to crochet. I already knew how to quilt. I already knew how to hand sew. I can't even begin to imagine how difficult it would be to regain that dexterity trying to do these kind of projects if I didn't already have that knowledge. And if I didn't know where to find that knowledge if it's not readily available. So when I see a pattern, when I see a design, when I see a product that supports it, the learning from the beginning without a tutor sitting next to you, when I see something like that, when I see videos that support that, I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge proponent of that because I know how hard it's been for me to get to where I'm at. And I can't imagine trying to do that without a teacher, without an instruction, and without a volume of patterns. So, was it a success? Whether it is my quilt from 14 years ago that I started the project and only finished quilting it a couple years ago, or the hat that I'm wearing, is a success. And my belief is that if it functions, if it is usable, if it gives us joy, if it is structurally sound, then it is a success. And we need to count that as our success, not whether or not it is flawless or the right gauge. All right, so I will leave this with you. I hope that you are having a wonderful new season, whether it is spring or autumn. I hope that you are enjoying some time unwinding with fiber and fabric, and we will see you again soon.